I hope that I can tell you a little bit about MMT, which has been more or less the talk of the town, also in academia. It's also starting now in Germany that there's more and more talk about it. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I think 2 days ago, I had an article also in Blätter für Deutsche und Internationale Politik about the question of whether Joe Biden and the US administration would be doing MMT in a way. So basically, the idea is that they are informed by MMT when they do macroeconomic policy. So I have my slides here in German mostly, but I will speak in English. Here's the title in English: MMT and the Green New Deal debate, financing the social and environmental transformation. That's going to be the second part of this lecture. The first part is just a plain explanation of what MMT is. MMT was sought out by Warren Mosler. So Warren Mosler was an investor working for US banks and thinking about money and thinking about how governments spend money and where they get their money from. And in the early 90s, he started putting his stuff into writings, which was just him. And about 25 years ago this year, he contacted some academics via some kind of message board. I think there was no internet like we see it today. So that was in 96. And then MMT was born when Warren Mosler contacted academics to talk about money. What is MMT? It's a description of monetary systems with the use of balance sheets. So it's a scientific method to explain what's going on when governments spend money, when banks create money, and when money is also destroyed when you pay a loan, for example, or when you pay your taxes. So modern money theory, as the name implies, is a theory. It's not, for example, an economic policy program. It's also not an ideology. So you cannot do MMT. Okay, so there is no question whether you can apply MMT to the Eurozone, for example. Doesn't make sense because it's just a question of explaining the things that we see. Okay, so it's not an ideology in the sense of that MMT argues that government should always be big or bigger, or that we should have more inflation. So MMT, just like other theories, economic theories, tries to explain reality. But of course, when you have understood how things work, automatically you think about improving the way that society works or the way that the monetary mechanisms are set up. MMT does not favor quantitative easing. Often bankers especially display as MMT the theory behind quantitative easing, but it's not. MMT does not always argue in favor of direct government finance. Okay, so we know as those who understand modern monetary theory that it's possible for a government to just spend without issuing any bonds. But that's not what we want in the sense of we don't argue consistently that this should be what's going on. That doesn't mean that some MMTers do not argue like this, but it means that the MMTers as a group don't argue like that. We also do not argue that somehow we should distribute a new role to the Treasury and the central bank. Again, MMT is often displayed as something of a game changer. People talk about fiscal dominance, monetary dominance. We don't know what they are talking about. In our view, it's not a problem for a central bank to set the interest rate at the same time as making sure that the government can spend all the money that it wants to. So when you hear about modern money theory, you often think, oh, that's a modern theory, but it's not a modern theory. Modern money is what Keynes is talking about in his book from 1930, a treatise on money. So he talks about modern states and the money that they are using, which would be charterless money, referring to Georg Friedrich Knapp, who said that money is something which the state creates. So it's coming out of the legal area of the state. So it's not a thing, but it's a legal instrument. That is why it's called modern money theory. And it's also an empirical theory, which is very interesting because we normally have very abstract theories in economics, and then we say, oh, you cannot falsify them. So the only thing that matters is that the predictions are more or less correct. When you study more economics, you will find out that in many cases, not even the predictions are correct, and you're wondering why you're doing this at all. the same goes, for example, for monetary theories, where it's assumed that money supply equals money demand, and then you have no idea what that is supposed to mean anyway. So MMT is falsifiable. So either it works like this in balance sheets, like we are claiming, or it doesn't. But the good thing is that if it doesn't work like this, we can falsify it, and then we adjust our theory and see how we can evolve. So that is, I think, something which is very interesting, because economics suffers from being too abstract and too mathematical. Well, having very beautiful models in terms of mathematics, but in terms of the assumptions made, these models often do not deal with the real world. Well, by now there's dozens of books, there's hundreds of articles, academic articles, and thousands of blog posts. In Germany, they have been ignored for a long time, but not anymore, I would say. So I can only introduce you to some of the aspects of MMT, but this is more like showing you the tip of the iceberg. I cannot give you an overview of over 25 years of research. That's impossible. So just because I don't mention something, for example, I probably don't talk too much about the money creation by banks. That doesn't mean that it's not important, but it just means that I focus here on the fiscal aspects of modern monetary theory, because I think that they are more important here. And I could later talk about something else. Okay, but if you have questions regarding that, please ask those questions later on, and I'll happy to answer those. So here's some claims here to support my view that MMT is also a thing in Europe. Here's Draghi in 2019 saying that the ECB should examine new ideas like MMT, which is a Bloomberg article. Same year, a little bit earlier, Christine Lagarde says MMT is no panacea, but may help to fight deflation. So again, here's European Central Bank officials talking about MMT. We had deflation last year because the value-added tax went down, which, by the way, is very interesting because it's often forgotten that the inflation rate has something to do also with taxes. So if you lower taxes, apparently you lower prices. And this also explains why we have higher interest rates, higher inflation rates, sorry, we have higher inflation rates now because we have reversed the cut in VAT all over Europe, which is why then the Eurozone has a little bit higher rates of inflation. Monetarism in this crisis was not able to explain the rate of inflation. If you look at the aggregates M1, M2, M3 in the United States, you can see that they grow by quite a lot. M1 grows by 75% in 2020, M2 by 25%, just as M3, but the inflation rate doesn't go up to 23% or 25%. Unit labor costs, however, on the lower right, they seem to explain the rate of inflation rather well. Okay, so if wages go up, the rate of inflation goes up, and if wages don't go up, well, then probably nothing happens. Okay, so I would claim that with this empirical evidence, the outcome of this crisis in terms of intellectual theories will be that modern monetary theory clearly will come out as the winner, being able to explain these phenomena where other theories cannot. We also say, for example, that the interest rate is rather connected positively with the rate of inflation. So if you look up your normal macroeconomics textbooks, it would tell you that if you put interest rates down, that then you will make the inflation rate go up. But that doesn't happen. So somehow the idea that low interest rates, and we've been in zero interest rate territory in the Eurozone for quite some years now, there's still no inflationary impulse that would confirm the view that somehow low interest rates cause higher rates of inflation. Okay, so this means also that inflation targeting as a macroeconomic policy is dead. I think that most central bankers know by now that making the interest rate go down once again will not increase private investment. And that is quite something. So I would say it was obvious for a couple of years, maybe even decades, but I think now that we have gone through this pandemic, it is clear that we need different kind of economic policy because the old economic policy just doesn't work. So what is MMT? So to explain MMT so that you get some kind of intuition, I'm not going to show you any balance sheets. I think it's too late for that in terms of time. So it's 6 o'clock now. So I rather prefer to take you on a little trip. So imagine that we are in Europe in the year 1700 something, and we have decided to go to America. We want to go abroad. We want to start over. and we take the next ship that takes us to America. And then when we arrive there, we look around, and because I'm not a specialist in colonial history, we ignore everything that has been going on. So let's just think that we start some kind of little village there, having no further interactions with people who have already been living in America before us, settlers from before Columbus and settlers from after. That doesn't matter. So if we create this little village, we probably build little huts and houses, each according to his or her own ability. And then we create some kind of garden. Probably we do some agricultural production as well to make sure that we can have some food. And that probably is possible without having any kind of monetary system. Okay, we're just building stuff. It doesn't matter whether there's money or not. There's raw materials, and we can rearrange them so we can produce output if you want. But at some point we might say, maybe it would be a good idea to have a road, and maybe it would be a good idea to have a public school, and maybe a couple of teachers would be nice. So how do we do that? So what we have noticed is that we need some kind of government which has to provision itself. Okay, there's something like public goods, like a street or a school, and paying also for teachers to provide education. These are public goods, and we need the government to provide itself with resources. So how do we do that? Well, that's kind of easy. I mean, we all know that how we do it. We spend money. But the problem is, for us, we don't have any money. Okay, so we don't have any money, but the good thing is we could print money ourselves. Okay, so if we decide to have money to solve this problem, then of course we need to think about what kind of currency name we would like to see, and what our money should look like. Of course, there would be other solutions, like people who would do it as volunteers, so people building a road. But I mean, if somebody's working as a teacher, it's kind of unfair to have a person volunteer to be a teacher for a couple of years. It's not very likely that you will find very good volunteers. So this kind of idea that you can provide the government with resources using modern money is something which is probably a provisioning mechanism which is superior to other provisioning mechanisms. Okay, for example, the state could just order a person to be a teacher. But again, these would be very unfair rules. So the question then, of course, is very obviously, where does the money come from? And because we just started our village, it's kind of clear that we have to print it ourselves, because there is no money. So the only way to spend money is to print money. That's the insight number one by MMT. So government is the source of money. It is the state as the issuer of currency that spends money into existence, okay, by paying people to work for the government. So let's assume that one of you is a good printer, maybe also an artist, okay, so somebody who's very good at drawing paper notes. I don't think that I have paper notes lying around here, but let's take just some kind of paper. So here's a paper note, okay, so you just write some kind of number on it. So here's now the number 1, which is on that little slip of paper. So that's a unit of currency. And for simplicity, we can call our currency the US dollar, or just the dollar, because it's America. There is no United States yet. By the way, this is built on an example, which is Virginia in the late 1700s. That is why I'm kind of have chosen this kind of example, because there's this evidence about the monetary system and how it really works. Okay, so now we have money, but the problem is that we probably won't find anybody who will be building our road. Okay, because if I'm the mayor of our little town and I have printed $1, and I ask people, will you build a road for $1? People will say, well, no, sorry, I've got other things to do, and I don't really need $1. So why should I accept your dollar? It's okay that you call it $1 and that you have it on paper, but I just don't want it. Okay, so you see, the problem then of a government is not that it cannot create money. Sure, it can. It's not a problem. Money creation is easy. Okay, just need to print stuff on a piece of paper. You imagine some kind of or you come up with some kind of name for your currency, and you have some nice drawings with maybe a pyramid and some kind of spooky eye on it, or whatever you pick, whatever kind of strange symbols. But it's easy to print money. The problem is, and that's Hyman Minsky, the problem is to get it accepted. Okay, so we have now the ability to print money, but there's no demand for money. People don't want it. So because we are the government, we can force people to demand our money. How do we do that? Well, we tax people. So that means that we can think about some kind of house tax. So we say, as the government, everybody who is living in our village will have to pay $1 at the end of the year. Otherwise, you will lose your house. Or you will go to prison. Or maybe first you'll go to prison, and then if you don't pay for another year, you will lose your house. That creates demand for our currency. That creates people who are willing to offer goods and services, and also real estate and maybe machines and whatever you can think of, to the government for payment in government's money. Okay, so modern money in a way is something which is coming out of the state, which wants to provision itself. It does not come out of the market as it is normally portrayed in macroeconomic textbooks. Okay, so once you force people to pay taxes, you make these people demand your money. And the good thing for the government is that you have a monopoly on currency. Okay, so because I'm the government, I'm the only one who's legally allowed to create that kind of currency. So I have a monopoly on that currency. Back then in 1700 something, there was no central bank yet. So it was just a treasury, and the treasury had the printing machine, a money printer. And if it wanted to spend, it just prints the money and spend it. Okay, so we can see then that the state has money and wants resources. Okay, so the textbook story has it the other way around. So for them, the government wants our taxes, but that's not how it works. Okay, the government has money and it wants our resources. That's why we have money. So the state spends, hopefully with a view to the common good. So we often now talk about public purpose. So the idea is that the government will help to create public goods, will spend towards the public purpose so that we are having a better life. Okay, so in 2021 in Germany, for example, here, the government spends money so that we can have vaccinations against this COVID-19 virus, so that we can have a better life. That's the idea, for example. We also spent money on education, spent money on pensions, we spent money on those people who don't have jobs, we spent money on all kinds of infrastructure. That's what I'm talking about. Of course, that doesn't mean that the government always spends money well. We also had cases of corruption in Germany where politicians gave contracts to companies and they paid a price which was way above the market price. So corruption is always a problem, obviously. So the main thing here is then that the government, when it spends, has only one possibility of spending money, which is, in this case, printing it and spending it. It is impossible from the start that the government can collect taxes, because taxes will have to be paid in state money. And if households do not have any state money, they cannot pay any taxes. The same with bonds. So if we would think that governments could somehow finance by issuing government bonds, you would be mistaken, because the people in our little village, in our little colony, it was historically that was a colony of Virginia. So the people in this colony, they don't have any money. They're not issuing money. So it's the state that issues money. So before people can pay taxes or buy government bonds, first they have to have money, and the only source of money is the government. Okay, so once we've understood that, we know that the textbooks are wrong because they talk about government financings. They think that government can be financed by taxes, financed by bonds. That's not the case. Okay, so it's actually the other way around. So people will have to finance. So if people want to spend money, first they have to make money. So first you have to have an income, then you can spend money. For the government, they just print money. They don't have to have an income. Printing money is not an income. Okay, so that means that there is no such thing as public finance. The whole concept of financing stuff, which means to have an income before you spend, doesn't apply to a monopoly issuer of currency. So that means then that the government spends money into existence, which is circulating in the monetary circuit. So if I pay somebody to build a road, that person might might buy, I don't know, a couple of apples from another person. So then the money is circulating. Okay, so it's not removed from circulation until people pay their taxes. And that's kind of a good thing. Okay, if you think about it, you want to have economic activity. So the whole idea that people are spending money to buy what they want, well, that's economic activity, and that's what we want to see, right? So spending money by the government is nothing bad. It's actually a good thing. The government is provisioning itself, and then people have money to buy what they want. That's part of the economic process. It's fundamental, and there's no problem with that at all. So if the government spends, it creates income for the households. So government expenditure must be equal to private sector income. So if I, as the government, if I spend $1, then of course the income of the households will be $1. And then of course, if the household spends the dollar again to buy some apples from another farmer, maybe, well, then I have GDP, which is $2, and income, which is $1. Sorry, government spending, which is $1. Okay, there seems to be some kind of multiplier effect that the money that government spends into the economy then is spent on and on and on. And that means that government is triggering some kind of expansionary economic process. Okay, what about unemployment? Well, when I kind of levy a tax on society as a government, so I force you to pay taxes, maybe $1 in 1 year, you will then say, oh, okay, so I want to supply some goods and services, which means you try to be employed. Okay, you're trying to sell something to the government or to anybody who's giving you dollars for whatever you have on offer. So that means that if the government doesn't spend enough money, there will not be enough money around in circulation to have full employment. Okay, so the government, when it's taxing, it's taking money out of circulation, and maybe it's doing that before everybody who wants to work can find a job. Okay, so the problem of unemployment is a systemic problem. So let's say, for example, if we are, I don't know, 20 people in our little village, and I spend only $15, that means there will be that 15 jobs will be created, but there's 20 people. Okay, so if we assume that nobody wants to spend his or her money, then we would have the situation in which 20 people are looking for work and only 15 can find it. How can you solve this kind of solution? Will you train those people who are unemployed to make them, I don't know, more knowledgeable? Will you add some skills to them? Well, it's a systemic problem. It's like you have 100 dogs and you have 95 bones. There will be 5 dogs that will go without bones. So the problem is not solved by training the dogs. The problem is solved by adding 5 more bones. And that is the same in the monetary system, where if you have unemployment, just spend more money. And that will solve the problem so that you have more employment. Okay, so that's the connection between unemployment and government spending. Then we can talk about deficits and surpluses. Okay, so I've said that I spend $1 to have somebody build a road, and now I'm spending another $1 to hire a teacher, maybe another $1 to hire another teacher. So I have spent now $3. Well, that's going to be a deficit of $3 for the government. It's going to be a public deficit, because we measure the public deficit by adding the adding up tax revenue and then subtracting government spending. And if that's negative, we have a public deficit. So because I just spent $3 into the economy and I didn't tax any dollars back yet, we have a deficit. That means also that we have a private surplus. Why? Because the households in this little village, they have received $3 in income and they will be saving that. Okay, so that means we have $3 of savings, which are caused in a way by $3 of government spending. So the people who want to save money and the government, which is in deficit, they are two sides of the same coin. Okay, if you want to have a society in which people are saving money, you need to have a government which is running deficits. Otherwise, it doesn't add up. Of course, in modern day Germany, you have the export sector. So because the rest of the world is buying more stuff from Germany than the other way around, people in Germany are able to save, well, some of them at least. But let's not get into that yet. Okay, so an important message here is that the government deficit is kind of a logical consequence of the way you set up a monetary system, because first your government spend into the economy and then later only you tax back. Plus people want to save some money too. Okay, so maybe they have some kind of uncertainty which is surrounding them, and they prefer to have $2 at the end of this year so they can pay $1 in taxes, and the other dollar they keep to pay later so that they could pay taxes next year. So this means they wouldn't have to work for the government next year, or they wouldn't have to work to get $1 next year, which might be a good idea for those households. Okay, so that's deficits and surpluses. And the whole thing, of course, is creating some kind of economic cycle, and it's also heavily influencing GDP. Okay, so if government spending is high, then of course the private sector, households and firms, expect that they can sell a lot of stuff, which also means that they will probably invest a lot of money. Okay, so you can see that in the US, for example. Okay, so the Biden administration is spending lots of money. Firms are investing quite a lot because they think they can sell a lot of stuff to the government. They hire more people, employment is going up. So that seems to be part of the economic cycle. Okay, so if you increase government spending, the business sector will know about this, and they know that the government spending is their income. And because they're not stupid, they also know that their income is what the profits will come from. Okay, so if you want to have profits, you need revenues. And then, of course, revenues over costs is profits. So in times of high government spending, you will have a lot of economic activity. And in times of relatively low government spending, you will have, well, maybe a recession or even a depression. You could see that in Greece, for example, in the 2010s, where you had a depression caused by austerity policies, where government spending was cut by roughly 20%, wages were also cut by 20%. Okay, so one of the points that MMT makes, and that's a description of reality, it's not an ideological point or something. The main driver of the economy in our societies is government, because government is so big. Okay, so government spending in our societies is maybe in Germany 40% of GDP, maybe 20, 25 in the US, maybe 50% in Denmark and Sweden. Well, and government has no limit in terms of spending money. They can just spend more money. There's no problem. The private sector will always have to finance spending. So the government is the main actor to make sure that aggregate demand, so that the amount of money the amount of money income that you create by spending is adequate for full employment. So that is why we say that the fiscal side is much more important for inflation rate and employment rate than the monetary policy side, where the central bank is just moving the interest rate up and down, but that probably doesn't do much to the economy. If it does anything to the economy, probably it will drive the price level up when you increase the interest rate. Yeah, maybe I can talk about this later on because it's a bit complicated. Okay, so let's wrap it up already. So money is nothing else but a tax credit. Okay, so the only thing that government is promising when it issues money is that you can make your tax payments using that money. That's all there is to it. Okay, so in a way, there is no such thing as government debt. I wouldn't call it debt. It's not a debt. Okay, there's no question that the government can spend more money. It cannot go bankrupt. Okay, so that means that money is really nothing else but a tax credit. And if you have a deficit or if you have public debt, it just means that people have some kind of monetary wealth that they haven't spent yet on taxes. That's all there is to it. Okay, so instead of public debt, I would say that's the monetary supply of the government, which is in the hands of the private sector and can only be used to make future tax payments. That, of course, sounds a little bit less dramatic than public debt. How do bonds come into this thing? The government might issue bonds in order to have some kind of positive interest rate established. Okay, so if you have savers who are holding on to dollars at the end of the year that they want to carry over into the next year so they don't use them to pay taxes, as a government, you might want to offer those people, those savers, a risk-free asset. You can say, you know what, I take your dollars and I give you a government bond, which is a promise of giving you more dollars next year. Okay, so it's like green dollars and yellow dollars. I think it's what Stephanie Kelton calls it. Okay, so you as a government, you swap green dollars for yellow dollars, which are government bond, which has an interest rate on it, maybe 5%, and that's all there is to it. But I would not call this a debt. Okay, so cash, for example, has a 0 interest rate, and the bond is something like a cash, like cash, but with a 5% interest rate. But there's no difference. Okay, so the yellow dollars give you green dollars, more of them than you spend on it in the future. And all you can do with the green dollars is pay taxes. That's all there is. So that means that, again, that public debt is really not a problem for a currency issuer. And maybe we can talk about the Eurozone, where it's also not a problem right now. Yeah, that's what it is. What about inflation? Well, if government spends, at some point it might not be able to buy up more stuff, because people say, well, you bought all the apples that there are, and I don't have any more apples. And also I'm already working full time, so there's no more apples. If you then need more apples, if you're the government, you can of course say, well, you know what, I'll just pay more. So if you paid maybe $1 for a barrel of apples, and then you promise to pay $2, well, yeah, you can do it. And probably the private sector will sell you some extra apples, but that will drive up the price level. Okay, so if you increase spending as the government at some point, if you think that you have to pay higher prices for whatever reason, then you're of course changing the price level. And then you're running into this problem that the resources might be scarce. So the government can buy everything that is offered to the government for its own currency, which might be a lot in the case of the United States, which can also spend US dollars worldwide. It might be very little, like in Afghanistan, where the central government is losing control over the territory. And if you have no taxman to collect the Afghan currency, probably then people will refuse to offer anything to the central government in return for government currency, because they say, well, because you're not collecting taxes where we live, we don't have any use for your little pieces of paper. Okay, so MMT does not say that somehow just because you have a central bank and a treasury, you will have a functioning monetary system. Just as an engineer would not say just because I build a motorway means you have somehow a reasonable traffic system. So there's more to it than that. So yeah, government then has a strong influence on the price level. It sets a lot of prices. In Germany, for example, it sets on the local level, it sets prices for the local bus system and local transport system. The national train system is also publicly owned. Prices are set also when people are charged to go to university or people go to the swimming pool. The state sets a lot of prices, also indirectly through maybe laws that affect the price of medicine, for example. Also because of taxation, for example, there's prices that will be affected by government's decision on taxes. So government has quite a lot of control over the price level, which is normally ignored. The sustainability of resources is also a big issue. Okay, so the government can choose which resources it wants to bring into the economic production system. If we, for example, choose to not exploit any more coal in Germany, we just might do that if we are the government, then of course we could say it's not allowed to spend money on extraction of coal or burning of coal. And then of course these resources would be out of bounds for the monetary system. So I know that some people say that if you increase government spending, you will have more resource use. But just because it was like this in the past does not mean that it has to be like this in the future. Okay, so it's definitely possible to have a monetary system in which an increase in government spending would not lead to an increase in resources. But it would depend on the government laws, of course, that affect this. Okay. So I think that's enough as an introduction to the fiscal side of MMT. Here's now some colloquial evidence from a book by Sharon Ann Murphy called Other People's Money, How Banking Worked in the Early American Republic. So she wrote that colonists were willing to accept this money partially because they had no other alternative, yet the government did promise to accept these same notes in payment for future taxes. Okay, so this story adds up. There's historical evidence that this is how money worked. So this kind of charterless story of how government provides itself with money is definitely true. How does that work in modern Germany? So in Germany, when the federal government is spending money, it does so by telling the German central bank to spend on its account. So what happens is that there's some kind of household here, and that households will get deposits because the government is buying some apples from that household. So the German finance ministry tells the Bundesbank to add some reserves, which is euros on the account of the Bundesbank, held by the bank here. So it just adds 100 euros in reserves. It does it with the help of the computer. This is the famous Target 2 system. So the bank then has more money held at the central bank. And because it knows that this is a payment to its customer, it also creates bank deposits, which are worth 100 euros for the household. Well, the Bundesbank, because it's receiving this order from the finance ministry, it's also debiting the account of the finance ministry. So that goes from 0. It always starts at 0 in the morning, or normally it does. It goes from 0 to minus 100. So that means when the German government spends, the federal government, it uses the central bank to mark up the account of banks. And that's a little bit odd, because most people, I would say almost all of the people that I meet at least, seem to believe that the German central bank has nothing to do with government spending, whereas in fact, it does all the government spending itself. So I don't think that I'm wrong here, but if I'm not mistaken, that means that 100% of the money that the federal government of Germany spends comes from the German central bank by marking up the bank's account. That's where it's coming from. Okay, so you can see here that the net financial debt of the government is equal also to the net financial wealth of the household. Okay, so public deficits equal private surpluses. And if you look at the stocks, then public debt equals private wealth, private financial wealth. Okay, so if the government then is selling government bonds the next day or the very same day, what happens is that the bank is offered to buy a government bond. So it does buy it by getting rid of the reserves it just acquired, which are then, now these are changes here in the balance sheets, which are erased by the Bundesbank, and the money is then moved into the account of the government. This more or less is a statistical value more than real money, because the government is owning the Bundesbank. And of course, if the government has deposits at the central bank, that's not a debt to the central bank, really. Okay, both belong to the state. That's like an IOU that I would hold myself. So imagine that I would have a piece of paper saying, the person who's presenting this piece of paper to Dirk Ehnts at the end of the year will get 1 million euros. If I hold this piece of paper, that's not 1 million euros. If you would hold it, maybe that would be 1 million euros worth to you. But if I hold it, that's not money. That's not an IOU. So it's the same here. So the money that is in the account of the government is not money at all. It's the statistic, as I said. So again, going back one slide, the government spends by having the central bank credit and mark up the account of a bank. It cannot do that technically by reducing the account of the Bundesbank, of the Bundesregierung, of the federal government. Okay, so if you're adding something in a spreadsheet, that money is not coming from anywhere. So if the German government is selling government bonds, it's bringing its account at the central bank back to 0, which is giving the Bundesbank the green light. So if on the next day, the Bundesbank sees that the government's account is back at 0, it can spend again on behalf of the German government. At the end of the day, the German government would have to go back to 0. It can also go back to 0 through taxation. So if I'm paying my taxes as a household, I get rid of my 100 euros, which are bank deposits, but the bank is paying the government 100 euros in reserves. If it can't do it, then my tax payment will not be happening. Okay, so if this is a Cypriot bank a couple of years ago and they were not able to make transfers inside the Eurozone, then of course I cannot pay my taxes using my money on the Cypriot bank account. So that means that the government is bringing back the account to 0 through tax revenues and bond revenues. Note also that in the English version of those words, it's called revenue because it's coming back to the government. It's coming from French revenu. So the money returns to the state. Bond revenues returns the government's money to the state. Bond revenues return the government's money to the state. Okay, so let's think about what's going on in Germany. This is about the available workers in Germany who are unemployed and underemployed. So it says that in April 20, or wait, let's take June. So June 2021, which is last month. How many people do we have that we could use? Well, we could have roughly 3.4 million people, we could have them working. Okay, so if the German government would spend more money, we could pull out 3.4 million German people out of unemployment and make them work if they wanted to. I believe that probably 90% of these people would want to work. So that, of course, means that macroeconomics is very important for society, because if we talk about unemployment, just being informed by MMT and understanding that it's possible to create money at zero costs and without limit, technically at least, it means if we would just spend more money, we would have more employment and we could offer nice jobs. That, of course, will be a game changer for our societies. So the unemployment rate of the Eurozone, since it started to exist in 2002 with the introduction of cash, 1999, the exchange rates were fixed. But all of that time, the unemployment rate of the Eurozone was above 7%. That's quite a lot. And that's also part of the reason why we have so much of a radicalization inside the Eurozone, because there's always unemployment and there's mass unemployment. 25% in Greece at some point. Also, youth unemployment is scandalously high. I think in Spain right now, more than 30% of young people that are under 30 years old don't have an income at all. That, of course, creates a radical generation because they are left out of the employment markets, or the labor market, if you want. Here's the timeline also with a figure. So you can see here that in the global financial crisis, unemployment went up to 5 million in Germany. Officially, it was 3.5, and then it went down. But still, we have, even in the best of times here, 2020 or 2019, before the pandemic, we still had more than 2 million people, according to official statistics. And if you take also those underemployed, it's almost 4 million people. Okay, so that means our economic policy is way too restrictive, and that's why we don't reach full employment. Okay, I'm hurrying a bit now because I'm running out of time here. So excuse me if I will be quick now. How about a Green New Deal? Well, there's different financing options, people are telling us, and these are not politically neutral. Remember that MMT says there's only one option to increase government spending, which is having the central bank make more payments on behalf of the government. That's the only way, the only possible way that there is for making payments. So our textbooks say there's different possibilities. So you could theoretically, our textbooks tell us, finance a Green New Deal via tax revenues. We will pay taxes, but that means, of course, we will have to tighten our belt. Again, that's not true. That's not what's going to happen, because it's just a misunderstanding of the monetary system. Second option that this kind of idea gives us is financing via more debt. So future generations would pay for our Green New Deal, which we would consider to be unfair, probably. Last option, financing via the central bank, which normally the textbooks say is dangerous because hyperinflation will result. Well, that all sounds pretty horrible, and probably nobody will want to vote for a Green New Deal if that's what you're offering. But MMT says there's only one way a government can spend, which is first comes spending, and then it's taxing this kind of money back from the household, which is, of course, politically much more attractive than all the other three options if you present this to voters. So this financing option will probably score much better than these three other mainstream financing options. And that is why we need, I think, we need to have this kind of Green New Deal. We need to have this understanding of MMT, because otherwise we will not persuade people that we can have a Green New Deal, which is beneficial to all of us. That is why I think that in order to transform our economies to become sustainable and to stop also climate change, governments need to spend more money, and they need to understand MMT. This public investment would modernize our infrastructure. And because of the uncertainty about future prices, especially in energy, the private sector will not invest. Okay, so MMT does not say that for ideological reasons that we have to have public investment, but it's just a matter of fact that if you want to invest in energy and in infrastructure, and you will get your money back in a way in the next 20 or 30 years, the private sector will not deal with this because there's just too much uncertainty. Without MMT, it will be politically easy to scare voters into believing that public deficits and debts are bad, like in the last 20 or 30 years, that also inflation would rise. So you could see how this normally is working in the public arena in the last couple of months, where there's a lot of people now shouting that we will have, I don't know, 5% inflation, maybe 10% in the US. I don't think this will happen because the wages are not growing that much. And also people are claiming that the exchange rate would collapse and or international competitiveness would erode, which are the normal arguments that you hear against a rise in government spending, often also from progressive economists. So MMT, I believe, is the only hope to counter macroeconomic myths that have been propagated in the last decades. And it's the only option, I think, that we have if we want to have a more progressive society and if we want to stop, especially climate change. So that's where I end for now. Thanks for listening, and I hope that you have a lot of questions.